You will never be respected, Dad said, as he laughed with my boss after I was passed over for promotion. Just be grateful they even hired you. 5 years later, they had to beg me for a partnership. Next day, their meeting room was dead silent. A few months ago, I sat across a long glass table, watching my former boss and my father shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Neither of them could meet my eyes. Dominic, once the loudest man in any room, was dead silent. My father, Arthur, kept glancing between me and the printed contract on the table like he didn't understand how we'd gotten here. Dominic finally cleared his throat and said, "We'd appreciate your support. We know this isn't conventional, but," I interrupted. "Let's not pretend we're here for pleasantries. You wouldn't be talking to me if you had any other option." Arthur looked at me, his jaw tense. "Mara, you're going too far." And I smiled, not cruelly, but quietly. Because 5 years ago, they both laughed while I stood in a hallway alone, heartbroken and humiliated. Now? They were asking me to save them. I've never been the kind of person who stood out at first glance. I'm average height, average build. Nothing flashy. I learned early that if I wanted to be taken seriously, I had to work twice as hard, and speak half as often. I grew up in Pittsburgh, in a narrow, cold house with a father who treated praise like it cost him something. Arthur worked in construction his whole life, and he loved reminding me that everything he had was earned with his hands. He didn't understand what I wanted from life, and frankly, he never tried to. When I got into Penn State for business, he didn't say congratulations. He just told me, "Don't come crying to me when you find out how much debt gets you nowhere." After graduation, I landed a junior analyst role at a mid-size consulting firm called Barrick & Lowe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a foot in the door. I poured everything into that job. Long nights, impossible deadlines, bending over backward for clients. No one really noticed, but I did it anyway. That first year, I was surviving off vending machine dinners and lukewarm coffee. I still believed that hard work spoke for itself. That someone would notice and say, "Hey, she deserves a shot." Someone did notice. Just not in the way I wanted. Dominic Russo was my direct supervisor, a man who preferred making deals over whiskey than in spreadsheets. He had a presence, that's for sure. But underneath the charm, he saw women like me, quiet, careful, driven, as assistants, not equals. I once tried to pitch an idea in a team meeting. I got halfway through before he waved me off and asked if I could send it over in a summary for Michael to review. Michael was newer than me. He didn't have my metrics. He didn't stay late. But he had charisma and laughed at Dominic's jokes. And that, apparently, was enough. When I found out Michael got the promotion I was working toward, I didn't even get a formal rejection. Just a group email announcing it. My name wasn't mentioned. I sat at my desk and stared at the screen for a long time. I wasn't surprised, but I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I'd given everything and gotten invisible in return. That afternoon, I heard laughter from Dominic's office. His door was half open. I didn't mean to listen, but it was impossible not to. Arthur was inside. They were talking about me. Dominic said something about how I took things too seriously. My father laughed and said, "Mara always thought she was smarter than everyone else. She should just be grateful they even hired her." And they laughed again. I stood outside that door for a solid minute. Not moving. Not breathing. Then I went back to my desk and gave myself 1 hour to cry. Not in the bathroom. Not at home. Right there, in the cubicle I had lived in for almost 3 years. No one noticed. The next day, I started making plans. I didn't quit right away. I wanted to be smart about it. I needed savings. A plan. I started consulting on the side, small projects, late at night, weekends. Helping local businesses streamline costs, restructure systems. Word of mouth grew fast. People liked that I explained things clearly, that I listened. I didn't talk over them. After a year, I had enough clients to make it full-time. I walked out of Barrack and Lowe with a folder of everything I'd ever built for them, and a promise to myself to never look back. I registered my business as Elira Partners, named after my grandmother. She was the only person who ever told me I could be more than what people expected. I kept her name alive through every document, every strategy session, every win. 3 years later, we had grown into a full-service consulting agency with 15 employees and a solid reputation for turning around struggling companies. I kept the company small on purpose. Every person on my team was handpicked. Most of them were people who had once been overlooked, quiet experts, like me. Then one afternoon, I got an email from a name I hadn't seen in years, Georgia, from HR at Barrack and Lowe. Her message was cautious. She remembered me. Said the firm was going through changes. Their last merger had tanked, their profits had dipped, and their clients were jumping ship. Leadership was scattered. Morale was awful. They needed help, someone to come in and rebuild from the ground up. They were considering external consultants. Would I be open to a conversation? At first, I laughed. I mean, actually laughed out loud. It felt surreal. After everything, they were the ones asking me for help. I didn't respond for a week. Not because I was being petty, but because I wanted to be sure I was ready. And then I said yes. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew exactly how to fix what they'd broken. Because no one else could do it better. We scheduled the meeting in their boardroom, the same room where I'd once sat through pointless updates, watching my ideas get dismissed. I walked in wearing black, not a power move, just something that made me feel sharp and present. Georgia greeted me warmly. The others? Not so much. Dominic was already seated. His hair had gone grayer. He looked thinner. Arthur was next to him, arms crossed like he expected a fight. When he saw me, his face faltered. Mara, he said, like the name was unfamiliar in his mouth. Dominic looked at the contract I had brought. This is aggressive. No, I replied, calmly. It's realistic. You asked for a complete restructure. This is what it looks like. You want full control? He asked. For 18 months, yes. I appoint interim leadership. I decide the direction. That's how we stabilize you. Arthur leaned forward. That's not how things are done, sweetheart. I looked him dead in the eyes. That's exactly how things are done when you've run out of options. Dominic didn't speak after that. He stared down at the terms, lips pressed tight. The room stayed quiet for a long time. No one in that room wanted to admit how desperate they were. That was the only thing saving my proposal, their silence. I watched Dominic chew the inside of his cheek as he flipped pages. His pride was clearly catching in his throat, but the weight of their situation was heavier. Arthur, on the other hand, kept trying to posture like he still held sway. This isn't personal, is it? He asked, half smirking, half daring me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because it wasn't personal anymore. It was, once. Back when I was younger, still foolish enough to believe approval meant respect. Still hungry enough to think working myself into burnout would get me noticed. Still naive enough to think my father would ever be proud of me for something he didn't understand. But now? I didn't need their validation. I didn't even want it. I wanted results. Georgia, ever the professional, broke the silence with a diplomatic nod. I think Mara's proposal is reasonable, given the circumstances. We can review legal specifics after today. But if we want a shot at survival, this is the shot. Arthur sat back in his chair. His arms were still crossed, but he didn't speak again. Not a protest. Not a single word. It felt like watching a wall crumble without a sound. Over the next few weeks, my team and I moved in like surgeons. I reassigned 5 department heads. Let go of 2 that were bleeding money through mismanagement. The company had been rotting from within: bloated expense accounts, outdated software, a total lack of accountability. I didn't fire people recklessly. I interviewed everyone, asked questions, took notes, listened to the ones who had been doing the real work quietly, the way I used to. I found them in every corner: assistants who had been running departments in everything but title, analysts who had built systems no one knew existed, account managers who kept entire client relationships afloat on their own. I promoted 3 women and 1 man within the first month, all of them internal. All of them were overlooked for years. I asked Dominic for an updated report once during week 3. He paused and said, "I don't actually know where that data is stored." It took everything in me not to smirk. But I just nodded and said, "Then let's fix that." Arthur, to his credit, kept out of my way. He still came to the office most days, sitting in on meetings like a silent relic. I wondered sometimes why he bothered. Maybe ego. Maybe denial. Or maybe, on some level, he was trying to understand how it had all happened, how the daughter he once laughed at had become the person holding the company he once admired by the throat. One morning, about 6 weeks in, I passed him in the hall. He was standing near the window, staring out at the skyline. "You always wanted to prove something," he said without looking at me. I stopped, not entirely sure if it was a question or a statement. He turned toward me, face unreadable. "Is this what you wanted? To show me I was wrong?" I looked at him for a long second. "No," I said. "I wanted to build something real. You just gave me a reason to get there faster." And I walked past him. I didn't go home much during those months. My apartment downtown was more of a landing pad than a living space. I ate at my desk. Slept 4 or 5 hours a night. But I wasn't exhausted, not like I had been at Barrack and Low before. Now I was running towards something, not just away from it. Every time we hit a milestone, reclaiming a key client, renegotiating vendor contracts, rebuilding team morale, I documented it. We weren't just restructuring a company. We were rewriting its DNA. One of the analysts who had been there when I first joined approached me after a strategy session. Her name was Danya, quiet, brilliant, forgotten in every room she'd ever been in. "I remember when you used to sit in that back cubicle," she said. Didn't say much. I didn't feel like I could, I admitted. She nodded slowly. "You're the only one who ever asked me what I thought. Not even the new bosses do that." I didn't have the words to tell her how much that meant. So I just said thank you. And I made her team lead the next week. Dominic eventually stopped coming to the office. There was no dramatic exit. No tantrum. He just stopped showing up after week 10. I heard later that the board had offered him a quiet package to go away. He took it. Arthur still hovered. He was no longer invited to leadership meetings, and nobody sought his opinion on restructuring decisions. But he came in anyway, loitering in the lounge, occasionally offering commentary no one asked for. I didn't have the heart to push him out. Not yet. One Friday afternoon, he caught me in the break room while I was grabbing a soda. "You don't need to keep me around," he said, unprompted. "I know," I replied simply. He looked at me then, really looked at me. "You think I was a bad father," he said. "I think you didn't believe in me," I answered. He nodded, like he expected that. Then he said something that surprised me. "Maybe I didn't believe in myself." And then he walked away. I stood there a long time after he left. Not because I was moved, or angry, or even conflicted, but because, for the first time in my life, I felt like we were finally having the same conversation. Even if it was too late for it to change anything. By the 3rd month, we'd hit every benchmark ahead of schedule. The board was over the moon. They called me into a meeting and offered me a seat, not just a thank you, not a bonus, but an actual executive partnership. It was everything I had once wanted. But instead of answering right away, I told them I needed time to think. Not because I was unsure, but because I finally could afford to take my time. That weekend, I drove out of the city for the first time in months. Took Route 28 up toward Kittanning, where the Allegheny River cut through hills so green they almost didn't look real. I stayed in a quiet little inn I'd found years ago during a college internship and left my laptop in the car. For 2 days, I did nothing but walk, think, and write in a notebook. Not a work journal. Just my thoughts. Memories, old ones I hadn't unpacked in years, floated to the surface. Like the time I'd won the middle school math competition and Arthur barely looked up from the TV. Or when I got my first internship and he joked that I'd probably be fetching someone coffee. He wasn't cruel, exactly. Just limited. He thought love meant feeding you and keeping the lights on. That respect had to be earned with your hands or not at all. He never understood that some of us were built for different kinds of work. And when I outgrew his narrow view, he saw it as betrayal. The truth was, I'd stopped seeking his approval long before the boardroom moment. But something in me still held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd see me clearly now. I thought about the offer. Executive partnership. A seat at the same table where I'd once been invisible. The full circle moment. But something nagged at me. Would I be sitting at that table as a symbol? A success story they could point to say, look how progressive we are now? Or would I actually have control? Did I even want to sit at their table? The truth was, I already had one of my own. When I returned to the office the next Monday, the energy had shifted. Everyone knew something was coming. I could feel it in the way people stood a little straighter when I walked through the halls. Not in fear, in anticipation. I went straight to my office, but not before noticing that Arthur wasn't in his usual spot by the lounge. His absence felt intentional. He wasn't avoiding me anymore, he was giving space. My team had already prepared the latest reports. Revenue was up. Expenses down. Client satisfaction had rebounded beyond projections. The firm was no longer drowning. It was breathing again. And yet, the partnership offer sat unopened on my desk. Georgia came by after lunch. She knocked lightly and leaned in, holding a folder. Board's ready when you are. No pressure. I looked at her, the only person in that whole building who had remembered my name all those years ago. She hadn't climbed the ladder fast, but she'd always done her job with integrity. I asked her a question I hadn't prepared. What do you think they really want from me now? She blinked, surprised. Then shrugged gently. Your brain. Your results. Your reputation, she said. But mostly? Your presence. Your proof it's possible to come back from a mess like this. And do you think they'll let me run it how it needs to be run? I asked. I think they'll try to make you comfortable. But not too powerful, she said honestly. Unless you write your own terms. I nodded slowly. That's what I needed to hear. Not flattery, clarity. I didn't go into the boardroom right away. I walked through the bullpen instead, stopping to talk to my team. Danya was walking a new hire through a client dashboard. Peter from finance waved from behind 3 monitors. I saw Anna, who I'd promoted last month, coordinating a cross-team workshop like a pro. These weren't just employees. These were people I'd trusted with something sacred, the chance to matter. And that mattered more than whatever corner office they were promising upstairs. I went back to my office and started drafting a proposal, not for a partnership, but a transition. I outlined a plan where Elira would complete its 18-month oversight contract, with full authority retained until the final quarter. After that, the firm would either implement our succession recommendations or decline further service. No permanent seat for me. No golden handcuff deal. We'd remain consultants, high-paid, high-control, zero politics. I reviewed it 5 times before I printed it out. When I entered the boardroom, they were already seated. The same polished table. The same nervous energy. Dominic's replacement, a younger man named Keegan, stood to greet me. The board chair, Mrs. Ellsworth, smiled warmly, trying to read me before I even sat down. "I understand we're ready to finalize everything today," she asked. I slid the proposal across the table. "Almost. I've made a few changes." The rustling of paper was the only sound for a while. Then came the faint click of a pen being set down. "This doesn't include a partnership," Keegan said slowly, confused. "No," I said. "It doesn't. But we agreed you'd." "I'm not joining the firm," I said, calm but firm. "I'm finishing what I started. And then I'm walking away." You could feel the mood shift. Not anger. Just a surprise. Confusion, maybe. "But why?" Ellsworth finally asked. "You've proven yourself. You'd have full support." And that's when I said something I never imagined I would say aloud. I don't need to be part of the place that once broke me in order to prove I healed. No one spoke for a moment. And I let the silence speak for me. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the old lounge area out of habit. Arthur was there again. He didn't say anything when I walked in. He was reading a local paper. Probably skimming the sports column. I sat across from him, unspeaking. After a while, he folded the paper and looked up. "You turned it down?" he asked. No tone. Just curiosity. "I did." He didn't react at first. Just nodded, then leaned back like he was settling into something he hadn't quite prepared for. "You were right to," he said finally. The room didn't move. The air felt thicker, somehow. I was wrong. About what mattered. About what you were capable of. He glanced at me, then away. "You did something I never could have done." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was something. Arthur didn't speak again after that. He just nodded once more, then stood and walked out of the lounge. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't linger. But it felt final, like he'd said everything he was able to say. I stayed seated for a few more minutes, watching the door swing shut behind him, feeling an odd stillness settle over me. There was no satisfaction in the moment. No cinematic swell of pride or vindication. Just a quiet understanding that something had finally broken loose, maybe in him, maybe in me, maybe in both of us. The next week at the office was quieter. Not literally, we were still moving fast, the phone still rang, and meetings still stacked up on my calendar. But emotionally, I felt like something had shifted. I was less reactive. Less haunted by old things. The bitterness that used to creep into my chest during every decision, every report, every walk past the conference room, it wasn't there anymore. I wasn't chasing their approval. I wasn't reliving that hallway humiliation on a loop in my head. I wasn't silently imagining the look on Dominic's face if I ever came back in power. I was in power. I had been, the whole time. And it didn't need to look like they thought it should. Still, the board was uneasy. A few of them reached out quietly over the next several days, not challenging my decision directly, but trying to coax me into reconsidering. Soft questions like, "Are you sure this is the right time to step back?" or "What would it take for you to stay?" I gave them polite answers and reminded them that we were still in control of the restructure. That we hadn't reached the end of our contract. That our goals hadn't changed. But I didn't give them hope I'd reverse course. Because I'd made my decision. And part of the strength in finally owning who I was meant letting go of who I used to want to be. Midway through the following month, I attended a company-wide meeting that my team had organized, not at Barrick and Lowe, but in our own office at Elira Partners. It was our quarterly vision session, where we gathered everyone to look ahead at what we wanted to build, who we wanted to serve, and how we wanted to grow. It had started as a Zoom call with 5 of us in a rented co-working space. Now we filled an entire event room. There was a moment during the presentation where I looked around and realized, this was the room I wanted to be in. These were the people I wanted to be surrounded by. The questions they asked. The energy in the room. The laughter between slides. The deep, quiet confidence that we weren't climbing someone else's ladder, we were building our own. Afterward, as people filtered out and grabbed lunch from the buffet we'd brought in, I sat in the back with Myra, our operations lead. She was older than me by about 20 years and had been the first real adult to believe in my vision back when Elira was just a messy idea on a whiteboard. She sipped her tea and nudged me with her elbow. You know, when you said you wanted to take on Barrick and Lowe, I thought you were crazy. I replied, half smiling. Just the right amount, though. She chuckled. Well, you scared the hell out of them. And you earned every second of it. There was a pause before she added, but I'm glad you didn't stay there. You don't belong in their story. That hit me harder than I expected. I didn't belong in their story. Because I had my own. A few weeks later, I received a letter, not an email, not a memo, but an actual handwritten letter. The envelope had no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably my father's. I opened it slowly, not sure what to expect. Inside, just a single page, no greeting, no closing. I don't know how to say this face to face, and maybe that makes me weak. But I've been watching. I've been listening. You built something bigger than I ever understood. I used to think the world didn't have room for people like you, people who wanted more. But maybe I was just scared because I didn't know how to want more for myself. You did it anyway. You earned their respect. But more than that, you earned mine. Dad, I read it 3 times. Not because I couldn't believe it, but because it felt so foreign to hear those words from him, written plainly, with no joke wrapped around them, no undercutting sarcasm to soften the vulnerability. For a moment, I didn't feel like a CEO, or a strategist, or a consultant. I just felt like a daughter. And that was the strangest victory of all. Still, I didn't write him back. Not right away. Not because I didn't appreciate the gesture, but because I needed to sit with it. I needed to understand what that letter meant in the larger picture of us, a relationship strained by pride, bridged by silence, and, now, maybe tentatively healing through words neither of us had ever learned how to say aloud. But I didn't hate him. That surprised me. I thought I would. I thought I'd carry that hallway moment, his laughter, those awful words, the shrug in his voice, like a stone in my chest forever. But now, after everything, I just felt tired of carrying it. I didn't need to win against him anymore. I just needed to keep building something that no one could take away from me. And I had. The restructure at Barrick and Lowe was heading into its final phase. We were 6 months out from the end of the contract. The numbers were better than expected. Their new leadership team, though not perfect, was functional. And for the first time in years, their employees weren't afraid to speak in meetings. Sometimes, I walked through their halls and barely recognized the place. Not because it had changed that much, but because I had. And I no longer felt like I didn't belong. But I didn't feel like I needed to stay either. Because I'd outgrown the version of myself who needed their validation. And I was finally ready to decide what came next, on my own terms. The final stretch of the restructuring moved fast, not because it had to, but because everyone at Elira worked like they had something to prove. Maybe it was loyalty to me, or belief in our shared mission, or maybe they simply understood that this wasn't just a contract. It was a story being rewritten. The kind that started with humiliation and ended with transformation. Every department at Barrick and Lowe had been touched by our team. Budgets rebalanced. Leaders reshuffled. We introduced internal mentorships. Built a performance system that actually tracked impact, not just noise. For the first time, people who had been ignored for years had a voice. The board watched with growing discomfort. Not because things weren't working, they were, but because they weren't used to being outshined by someone they once dismissed. They thought they were buying a fix. What they got was a mirror. And I think that's what unsettled them the most. 3 weeks before our contract was set to expire, I received an email marked urgent. Another closed-door board meeting had been scheduled. I was invited, not required, but strongly encouraged. I went. When I entered the room, it felt different than before. The board members were seated, yes, but quieter. Warier. Mrs. Ellsworth, ever the diplomat, spoke first. Mara, thank you for coming. We've reviewed the final progress reports. We're impressed. I said nothing. Just wait. She continued. We've come to a unanimous agreement. We'd like to extend a formal invitation for you to take the role of managing director. Not as a partner. As the head of the firm. The offer hung in the air like perfume. Carefully worded. Calculated. Almost respectful. But I saw through it. They didn't just want me. They wanted ownership of my reputation. They wanted to polish my story and hang it in their lobby like a token of their redemption. Look who we chose. Look who we allowed to succeed here. I leaned forward, folded my hands, and said calmly, no. A silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain. Mrs. Ellsworth blinked. I'm sorry? I'm not interested, I said, clearer now. The restructure was a contract. That contract ends in 3 weeks. You'll have my final recommendations and documentation by then. After that, Elira moves on. But we're offering you everything, another board member said, incredulous. You could shape this firm however you see fit. I smiled. I already did. From the outside. With none of your permission. I stood up, collecting my folder. You don't get to claim me now. The silence this time was different. Heavier. More permanent. And entirely mine. When I walked out of that boardroom for the last time, the air outside felt lighter than I ever remembered it. I didn't cry. I didn't gloat. But I did take one final stroll through the floor where I used to sit. The cubicles had changed. The color of the carpet maybe. But I remembered that space, the weight of invisibility, the coffee that never stayed hot, the long hours of proving myself to people who'd already made up their minds. At the far end, I saw Danya, still deep in conversation with a junior staffer. I stopped by her desk. Take care of this place. She looked up and grinned. Only until you come back and buy it. I laughed. Don't tempt me. Back at Elira's office, my team surprised me with cake and champagne. The conference room was filled with laughter and music. No speeches, no fanfare, just the quiet joy of knowing we'd done something no one thought we could do. After the celebration, I stepped out onto the terrace alone. The city stretched below, bridges and rivers and steel bones gleaming in the evening sun. Pittsburgh had always been a city of workers, of builders. It felt right that I'd rebuilt something here. Myra joined me after a while. She handed me a small envelope. What's this? I asked. A little something from your team. Just open it. Inside was a printed email thread, a screenshot, actually. From Barrick and Lowe's internal Slack. It was Arthur. He'd sent a message to all department heads that morning. For what it's worth, Mara didn't just fix this company. She saved it. And she didn't do it with ego or shortcuts. She did it the way good leaders do, with vision, with grit, and with people who believe in her. If you were smart, you'd build around her example. I didn't expect the sting in my eyes. Guess he came around, Myra said, clinking her glass against mine. Eventually, I said softly. And that was enough. 6 months later, Barrick and Lowe was bought out by a global consultancy. It wasn't a hostile takeover, but it wasn't celebratory either. The board cashed out. The firm was absorbed. The name, that towering legacy, was dissolved into a 3-letter acronym barely anyone recognized. I didn't attend the announcement. But I heard through Georgia that Dominic had tried to get back in through a side door. Some vague consulting pitch. They declined. Michael applied for a job at Elira. We didn't call him back. Arthur retired. He sent me a photo of his garden a few weeks after. He'd written Elira in white rocks along the flower bed. No note. No explanation. Just a picture. I framed it and put it on the shelf behind my desk. Because it wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. And I had. The best revenge wasn't winning their game. It was walking away from it altogether and building something they could never take credit for.